I want to start by expressing my gratitude for the invitation to participate with you tonight, to, of course, the director, Paco Javier Rodriguez, whom I've known for a while, and of course to my friend Benjamin Ross, and my gratitude to everybody that's hearing, and I'm very happy to share this panel with Jose Castillo and with Gabi. And well, I will start the presentation with a quote by Aldo Rossi. Why do we speak about cities? He says, one cannot make architecture, and we want to make architecture, without studying the condition of life in the city. Aldo Rossi. So we'll start with Mexico City, and I will speak mainly on the growth and sprawl of the city, some issues of mobility, water situation in Mexico, underutilized areas, some views of the city, to end with some of our projects in Mexico City. So this is Mexico City in 1980. You can see that the map already tells us this area, the smaller area, is Mexico City, and the bigger area is the state of Mexico. And Mexico City has sprawled to the state of Mexico continuously, and the importance of cities, as you know, is that 75% of global GDP is produced in cities. In Mexico, it's 82. 55% is urban population. In Mexico, rises to 78, 2% urban growth worldwide, and 2.4 in Mexico. How have we sprawled? Well, you can see that the Mexico City in 1980 is this very light color mark. Then it grows to the darker brownish color. In 1990, oh, sorry, what did I do? In 1990, the blue color is, well, the blue color is 2010, the turquoise is 2005, and then the red is 2020. The city has grown 4.2 times in its territory in the last 40 years. And the population only grew 1.5 times. So there is a unrelated growth. And of course, Mexico City, the city itself, grows much smaller than the sprawl in the state of Mexico. So here you see Mexico City grew 2 times in its territory in 40 years, but only 1.04%. So the population grew really very, very little in these 40 years. And if we see the state of Mexico, it's the opposite, because the territorial area grew 7.8 times, while the population grew 2.3 times, creating really a big sprawl. And the biggest problem of Mexico, of the state of Mexico, is that the growth is a growth that it's not friendly. It's leapfrog growth. So this dispersion is a real challenge to the city, but at the same time, a great opportunity. Some of the challenges of mobility. Well, here we see some of the challenges of mobility. To go across the city, it takes from east to west 20 hours by private car, but by public transportation, more than 5 hours. And north-south is 3 and some, and almost 6 hours to cross the city from north to south. So this is a big challenge. We have different types of trips a day. And in principal, origin to destiny, we have 16.6 million trips a year. Some of them are done in public transportation, some in bike, some by foot. A lot of trips are made by foot. Some begin and end in the same municipality or district. Some go across. And if we go to this pie of how we move, Well, we move generally 65% of the mobility is in public transportation, 26% in private cars or other means, and then we have walking and some other types of transportation. I won't go to the detail, you have it there, and you can see that we, in Mexico, we spend most of the resources to build roads for private cars, while people really move more in public transportation. I have to do something here. Oh, okay. If we see what has happened with the water in Mexico City, you can see that in the 11th century, Mexico City was in the water. And we started covering the water areas, the lakes, creating lots of problems for our city. Today, we have a big problem because we dried all the lakes in the city and we have to pump and bring the water from far away in a system called Lerma Cuchamala. And we bring the water up to the city, and the use of water is not the most sophisticated, because we lose a lot of water in the pipes that transport the water. If we reflect in here in the first map, where you see the big lakes of Mexico, the lake of Texcoco, only this lake, covered 1,000 square kilometers. So we had a lot of water and dried it. These maps, I think they are interesting because you can see that the pre-Hispanic city, Tenochtitlan, was this little city in the middle of all these lakes. This is the Lake of Texcoco, Xochimilco, the Lake of Chalco, and the Lake of Mexico. This is how the roads work today. The red roads were roads that were built already in the pre-Hispanic times. And all the other roads were built beginning in the 14th century. We have one big road crossing the city from north to south. You see it here. It's Insurgentes. And then we have some that go across, but don't go across all the way, creating a lot of problems of transportation. Here we have the nicest city, or the nicest street in the city, Avenida Reforma. Well, just to give you an idea how we are built. So we are used to floods. This was the city center flooded in 1920, but we had it again in 1945. And this is a flood 3 years ago in the peripheral areas of the city. If we go to the areas of opportunity, we have a lot of underutilized zones that were used by industry, and the industry has left. And we have vehicle deposits that shouldn't be in the center of the city, and some police and military and training center. And that creates a lot of reusable areas in the city, which are great opportunities for development. Here you see some of these areas that shouldn't be working now, like vehicle deposits and junk yards in the city. They should be away, far from the city, or some industry that has lost its value being in very well located parts of the city. Here is our city. We have a beautiful main square called the Zócalo, is the heart of the city, the biggest main square in all of Latin America. It's almost more than 11 acres, and it's part of our patrimony. Our downtown is a protected area, was declared World Heritage Site, and I believe Gabriela, Gabi will speak about it. It has many opportunities of redevelopment, of reconstruction, of refurbishing of many of the buildings in the downtown area, mainly because the lower parts are used by by business, but the upper parts are either void or used as storage area, which creates a big problem for the city. Here you see another area, another side of our downtown area. This is the Palace of Fine Arts, our cultural center, and the way the city has developed. And I brought some pictures so you see how the city has developed in very different areas. This is the west of the city. The west of the city is probably the best area developed, not the only one, but we have this mixture of residential areas and tall buildings, a little bit hectic, but they have gardens, they have a good balance of open and enclosed spaces. Here's another view. It's also part of the west side of the city, the area of Polanco that is very valuable now, and that underwent our refurbishment but with very strict laws. So it developed in a very good way. Here we see Palmas, against the west of the city, with this mixture of housing and tall buildings. More tall buildings are coming up. This is, as opposed, the east side of the city. This is the northeast. It's the street of Tlalpan, almost the border, where on the west the city is better developed, and on the east it's another type of development with a lot of sprawl. And this is an intermediate northwest again. But what's interesting is we're seeing all these new developments in the last 20 years of housing, replacing areas that were areas for industry. So the city is changing and creating opportunities for housing. These opportunities still exist, and I believe Jose Castillo will speak of some of them, and also on the mobility. That's why I didn't speak more on that. Then we have some remains. This is what remains of the lake of Xochimilco. As you can see, it's very, very little. And apparently we want to continue drying our city. And this is the growth in the northeast of Mexico City, already in the state of Mexico, Ecatepec. You can see that it's very low raise, very, not so low density, but low density. And it's a very inefficient consumption of soil, and a discontinuous urban structure. So in Ecatepec also, there is a lot of opportunities, and especially we should create space for parks. You can see that in these areas, we almost have no green areas. The city needs green areas to function properly, and especially people need green areas. They are the areas where public spaces are best used. Now, in this sprawl to the northern side of the city, another of the municipalities of the state of Mexico, we see these developments made by developers, but the problem is that they are eating the best areas of agriculture. The traditional agricultural areas are replaced with these housing complexes that are very repetitive, that are very far of the city. People need to pay more for transportation to their work than what they pay for the mortgage. So many of these housing units get abandoned, and they create areas of insecurity, and we should avoid these solutions. Finally, now the laws are discouraging this type of solutions, and it's so impersonal, this development. And you can see again, no green spaces, no green areas. We start seeing some, like here in the middle, a little bit of space, but it's too little, and we should protect these green areas that, on the other hand, take care of another problem of all cities, and it's how you bring food to their cities. We have a few very good examples through the time. This was a housing complex built in 1947-49 by Mario Pani. It's an excellent example of how Mexico looked at joining modernity. It is a mixed-use complex, like of what we speak today. It had everything, 800 apartments, but it had already a recreational center, a commercial area, a swimming pool, a church, a healthcare facility, everything. So we should look at these solutions because they are inspiration of what we should do today. Or this was a slum area surrounding the city that was transformed to this extraordinary project built between 1960 and 1965. It brings new approaches to the city, tall buildings, 15 super blocks, and altogether it holds 11, almost 12,000 apartments. But again, with all the facilities needed, it has 22 schools, 6 hospitals, of course, sports centers, office buildings, and all the shopping needed. And what are we facing now in the 21st century? Well, urban reconversion. So we have a few good examples. This is Antara in an area called Granadas. This is this road was, or this avenue was like a barrier between the industrial area and the housing area. This industry was the factory of General Motors. Finally, the factory left and a new project came that is called Antara. This is that border between both areas, the housing and the industry. So now the border is broken because here is the first project that's a shopping center with office buildings. And the results are amazing because this is what happened in the area. With this first open area shopping center with office buildings, the whole area changed. So now we have museums and housing buildings and a real project of redensification, increased a lot the real estate value. Here, the shopping center was also very creative because it's a shopping center with no anchor store and with a big open space in the middle. Another reconversion that I think is wonderful, this was refinería. I don't know the word in English. I forgot to look it. Eh?
The oil refinery.
Oil refinery that was closed in years ago. I think in 1991 it was closed because it generated a lot of pollution in our city that we don't need, and it stayed there till 2007 when the government decided to turn it to a big park. So now the whole area is this park called to celebrate the bicentennial of our independence. And it's, I think it's a wonderful park. It has a great project by 3 very good Mexican architects. It has orchid garden. It has some greenhouses, and it has green areas all over. It has walking paths and biking paths, and it's used intensively by the people in all these areas that had no parks. So this is an excellent reconversion. And then I'll talk a few of some of our projects in our office. This, again, was an empty lot in the area of the Nextengo. We created this project that has 128 units. They vary between 55 and 60 square meter. It hasn't been built yet, but well, it shows some of the opportunities our city shows. This is also a project from our office. It's a tall building. in the in Reforma, in the intersection of two of the main avenues of our city, Insurgentes and Reforma. We see the existing buildings and our proposal of a new building. It needed to protect 3 houses here that are protected. So we created this big podium, 3-floor podium that covers the houses, and the houses themselves become part of the facility. Then we have, and then the body of the building. We don't know if the building will be built because right now it's in standstill because of the problem we're facing in Mexico of a slow investment scheme. This building is 40 levels tall and has 4 underground parking. So we hope that things will get better and we'll be able to build it. These 2 have been built. This is a project of a housing complex in the center of Mexico City, downtown, in the street of Humboldt. It also an underutilized lot that is very well located. It holds 42 apartments of 63 square meters and 55. It's 2 blocks away from the main park in our downtown area, from the Alameda. And that's how it looks. It's already finished. It's already inhabited. Of course, the developers changed some things in the projects, mainly the colors, but the building is a big success and it creates opportunity of housing in the downtown area. Another project that's now under construction is on Tintoretto, very well located area, also an empty lot that had no use, and it will hold 51 apartments in 6 levels. And also it's been very successful in the area. We hope to see it finished in the next 3 or 4 months. Well, these are in very short time and very condensed information what our city offers and the opportunities we see. Here's a look view of our city. And I put this, what did I do? Yeah, this poem of Octavio Paz, because I think he depicts in a very beautiful way the challenges we have in the city, especially the last part where he says, I speak of the city that dreams us all and that all of us build. And I don't know why I can't read it because I couldn't change the screen and I don't have it here. But I beg you to read it. I love this part where he says that the city goes to sleep for 100 years, wakes up and doesn't recognize itself. Of course not. Cities are in constant transformation. And this is just to see the scope, our city that almost is an endless city. Thank you. I think now we will listen to Gabriela Lee.
Well, I'm very grateful to be sharing this panel with my friends and colleagues, Sara Topelson and Jose Castillo. It's the first time that I'm doing something that's a live presentation and a Zoom presentation at the same time. So I hope both audiences can hear me. I will share my screen. So I will want to speak about the conservation of natural and cultural heritage as an opportunity for achieving urban sustainability. And this relates to many of the issues that Sara spoke about before me. And this relates also to the idea of placemaking and local identities, which I think is very important. So in this very small abstract, I would say that prevailing criteria for including heritage conservation in urban planning policies in Mexico has been so far insufficient to revert the loss of our urban heritage. And I think there is a very interesting tool, which is the notion or concept of the historic urban landscape as promoted by UNESCO. This document is now 10 years old. It was written in 2011. And I think it's a multi-dimensional tool for the comprehensive management of urban development, which includes natural and cultural heritage of various scales within urban settings. And this is a way of achieving more meaningful and sustainable living environments. So I will quickly go through these talking points, which I mention here. So the first is about the evolution of this notion of cultural heritage, because the scope of what it comprises has increased considerably over the past half century. There are a great number of variables playing out to define what is heritage, what is its purpose and its meaning. But all of the cultural assets, let's call them cultural assets, share these four dimensions, the physical or spatial, the cultural, the symbolic, and the temporal. And this allows heritage to build on historical continuity, which is the appropriation of the past in the present and its projection into the future. So here in these pictures, I try to sum up this idea of natural and cultural heritage, of all the categories that make it up. And they are all sort of under this umbrella of what cultural heritage means for UNESCO, no? Everything that we should be able to preserve or that it's meaningful to preserve for future generations. And it comprises built heritage, the environment of that built heritage, which can be the urban or the natural surroundings, intangible cultural heritage and landscapes, whether cultural or natural. And we should ask ourselves, well, one thing are official listings, maybe government institutions that define what should be listed as heritage or not. But we should also reflect on whose heritage this is, because if it's not appropriated by regular citizens and communities, it loses its meaning. So the various scales and categories of heritage as defined by UNESCO, it came to a point where UNESCO realized that this was not enough to protect cities, to protect urban landscapes. So they came up with this notion that they called historic urban landscape, which tries to strike a balance between conservation and modernity. In the face of all the pressures, all the threats that urban landscapes are facing. And the solution is more or less to go through this idea that we should consider cities and landscapes as living organisms, which need to admit a certain amount of change. The first document that was like a first draft was the Vienna Memorandum of 2005. And then in 2011, this recommendation was published on historic urban landscapes. And they defined this term as the urban area understood as the result of a historic layering of cultural and natural values and attributes, which extends beyond the notion of historic center or ensemble to include the broader urban context and its geographical setting. So this can include modern neighborhoods or semi-rural or suburban areas, not necessarily what we call historic centers. This HUL, as they call it in short, includes geographical features, the built environment, infrastructures, urban structure and patterns, social and cultural practices and values, the use that people make of these spaces, but also economic activities and the intangible dimensions of heritage. So it's a very broad definition. No? Some of my students told me the other day, well, then anything can be heritage. Well, it could. It can if a community decides that something is worth protecting or worth preserving, in this perspective. Something that I find very interesting is that this notion of HUL really relates to the idea of sustainable development. A lot of recommendations and international documents recognize now that culture, and therefore heritage, is one of the pillars of sustainable development and is directly linked or related to people's well-being. So that's why I think it should be considered explicitly in urban planning policies. Some other documents from Unesco and ICOMOS also speak of heritage as a driver of economic development and a driver of sustainability. So I think the conversations should really focus on the opportunities of this outtake, this perspective. And a second point that I find very interesting is that this HUL recommendation thinks of the conservation of historic environments as management of change, as a way of setting criteria for transformation and criteria for incorporating contemporary architecture. And this would allow to build a historical continuity. I chose two examples here, which I think are really a good answer or a good response and integration to historic settings, which is the municipal building in Murcia by Rafael Moneo, and this cultural center, the Carré d'Art in Nîmes by the team of Norman Foster. So what I would say, we have paradigm shift number one, which is that heritage studies have become interdisciplinary, and they focus on the present interpretation or appropriation of the past, not only in the material conservation of the past. And you have heritage studies in many different areas, that look at the materiality and location of buildings or monuments, but also processes of building memory, building identity, and building narratives. Paradigm shift number two is to look at heritage as a system within the complexity of cities, which are also living organisms. And the HUL concept, the historic urban landscape, must be based on social perception. It is a social construction and not a top-down approach, where maybe some authority or a group of experts will tell us what needs to be preserved. So we should look at heritage as a process in the building and not as a set of objects. So here the pictures I chose show the transformation of the Villa de Guadalupe, the most important shrine in Mexico, with 100-year difference between both pictures. Now, why is this so difficult to achieve, I think, in Mexico so far? We have a legal framework to protect cultural heritage, which looks at all the different categories of heritage. And here I show the institutions or agencies that are in charge of each category. And I find that the three that I underlined in red, urban heritage, cultural landscapes, and of course the historic urban landscape, are most at risk, because we have a very fragmented vision of our heritage, especially our urban heritage. There are a lot of regulations that overlap with each other or that leave legal voids, which make it more difficult to preserve this type of heritage. Historic urban landscape is not really considered yet in our legislation. The only exception is that last year, one law was written by the government of Mexico City, which for the first time includes historic urban landscape as one of the categories to preserve. But there are no rules of procedure yet, and there are a lot of missing documents or missing steps yet to be developed so that this can be integrated with pre-existing regulations. What you see in these maps is the outline of Mexico City with all the heritage conservation areas. There are over 160 of them in the city. And the map on the right shows like the chronology of these areas, which are of pre-Hispanic origin or colonial origin, or more recently 19th and 20th century. So the fourth point, and I'm going to try to sum this up, is what are the implications for urban planning policies? I think we have a regulatory type of planning in Mexico City, which was initially aimed to regulate urban growth, sort of control city growth, urban growth, and provide adequate infrastructure. But I think growth actually occurs more often by independent or individual projects, which are very often unconnected to each other. And it's a traditional top-down approach. Since 1997, all of these urban development programs include heritage conservation policies in them. But I think the main problem is that these policies have been, they are enforced in a parallel manner to urban planning. They're not really integrating heritage into urban planning. And this has resulted in the loss of a lot of protected areas. In this comparison that we made with my students, between 1997 and 2018, we actually lost over 5 square kilometers of heritage conservation areas, because if you treat them as special areas where everything is forbidden, they fall into a state of decay. And then maybe a few years after that, when you update the urban development programs, you don't really see a reason to protect them in such as heritage conservation areas anymore. I see the HUL approach, now the historic urban landscape approach, as an opportunity because most recent proposals for sustainable urban planning instruments in Mexico do not explicitly include cultural heritage. An opportunity where I see a chance to develop an approach that's bottom up, that includes citizen participation, is in the latest methodological guides for drawing new municipal and metropolitan urban development programs, which haven't been enforced yet. So the UNESCO proposes a toolbox for the historic urban landscape and a set of stages for applying these ideas to actual urban planning. I think the most important one, which I want to underline if I still have time, is social participation. And on the right, what I wrote out in red, how do you make an inventory of natural and cultural resources? How do you identify the values and attributes present in that inventory of natural and cultural heritage? Vulnerability evaluation of heritage, participatory planning for conservation and regeneration, and then the drawing out of the plans and implementation. And last but not least, how do you draw indicators to evaluate the impact of your policies on on heritage conservation? So very briefly, I will run through 3 of these items. The first is an inventory of natural and cultural resources, which should be the sum of official listings, catalogs, maps, databases, produced by experts or produced by authorities, but also consider participatory cartography, collective mappings, mental maps, surveys, interviews, anything that will reflect what people think of the environment where they live. So we should think of heritage construction as a collective action that implies the participation of all stakeholders or all social actors. And I think here, especially in central areas, for example, of Mexico City, where the resident population has been reduced dramatically sometimes, but you have a lot of temporal or temporary population, no, people who come in to work, to run their businesses, who come as tourists to visit. Maybe they don't live in the area, but maybe they should also have a say about what's happening in that territory. So here you see a couple of examples of official cartography and then examples of collective mapping, of what people think is valuable in their environment. And in this particular instance, I tried to translate the results of a bunch of interviews and yes, basically in the interviews and surveys into a cartographical base that would be comparable to official maps, official heritage maps by government agencies. The second step that UNESCO mentions is to be able to do a collective identification of the values and attributes present in the inventory. An inventory is necessary because if you don't know what's valuable, then how can you preserve it? And the second thing is to identify which values are present in that inventory. So here I used a list of values for built heritage, according to these authors and wording, but you would have to add values, a value list for urban environment and for the natural environment to be able to map out those places, each type of value. And then to be able to prioritize elements by defining which attributes and components of the environment embody these particular values. So to the right, you see a couple of exercises I did with my students. The first is a value mapping in an area in central Mexico City. And the second is like what we call the value concentration. So we could see that certain areas within a neighborhood concentrate a higher number of values and therefore should become a priority when you try to do an urban regeneration project, for example, within this neighborhood, So you make sure that you're not going to destroy what people think is valuable in their immediate vicinity. Heritage vulnerability, well, I won't stop very much. I love this image of Venice with a cruise ship in the middle, there's so many things that threaten our heritage, natural phenomena, the dynamics of urban transformation, mass tourism, socio-economic trends, and also the compatibility of what you want to do with what the built heritage will allow, according to its structure, its history, et cetera, et cetera. The indicators for impact evaluation, there's a lot of literature on this, especially in the Unesco manuals, the HUL guidebook, but also examples of best practices of how certain cities, especially in South America, in Europe, and in Asia, have tried to apply this approach to urban planning policies. So in these websites that I show here, you can, if you're interested, you can look up certain of these, some of these best practices. The methods are in the making. I mean, there's a lot of proof and error. One of the things I have done is I've tried to adapt some of these cases of best practices to workshops and graduate course with some of my students, a course on cultural heritage and sustainable urban development, in which we try to work or study a particular neighborhood and then try to apply this method and see what comes out. I think this approach that I'm talking about really is part of the larger conversation of about perspectives on urban sustainability. Whether we're talking about urban design, new urbanism, urban renewal, placemaking, we're sort of trying to put people at the center of the conversation. And I think this approach that I've been presenting today, the historic urban landscape, is a tool that we could really find useful. And of course, I'm always thinking about examples in my own hometown, in Mexico City. But I think it applies to a variety of contexts. I think the shift is to really try to make places that are more livable for its citizens, for people, and not only respond to economic dynamics or real estate pressures, no, because then we forget who we're designing for, right? So I think cultural and natural heritage are part of this larger canvas, you know, that we should be talking about. So I think that's pretty much the end. Yes, this sums up a lot of what I've said. No, I think it's urgent to consider, to build a vision of our cities in the future that considers the role we wish for the inherited cities. No, and I see that some of the, Benjamin's students are here. This picture that you can see with a ring of lavender colored trees are the jacaranda trees we were talking about. No, and this, for example, this landscaping and even the pattern of this particular neighborhood are part of its identity. No? So even if it's a 20th century neighborhood, maybe we should, well, take into consideration all of these urban structure aspects in it. No? So thank you very much. Okay, there. Now we can leave it to Jose.
Yes. Now we turn it over to Jose Castillo, Dr. Jose Castillo, please.
So thank you, Benji. Thank you, Paco. It's a pleasure to hear and to reconnect. It's been over 20 years since we started talking and discussing many of these things. So it's nice to be here amongst friends. And thank you to everyone in the UIA-UC community. I'm gonna talk briefly and present over the next 15-20 minutes some of the work we've been doing at our firm 911, along with my partner and wife, Saidi Springle. And it has to do with some of the issues that Sara and Gabby have already talked. It is about understanding that the profession of design and the act of practicing architecture and practicing landscape design and practicing urbanism is one of researching and doing, of control and lack of. It is about understanding how to pick your battles, but to also understand how the context where we work shapes the attitudes we have towards the built environment. And in some cases, it involves work along cultural heritage, in some other work along mobility and housing, which are the two topics I'm going to be talking about. But in many cases, it talks about not only the opportunities and the challenges of Mexico City, but I was thinking, just looking at the last 10 days of events in Mexico City, it is more about clear and present dangers, as to do the Tom Clancy novel. So last Tuesday, we had a 7.1 earthquake after a big storm, which produced one of the most apocalyptic landscapes in the Mexico. Not only you had people walking out in their pajamas, but suddenly the whole sky lighted blue through reasons no one can clearly explain in a scientific way. But it is a kind of a reminder that we are living in a valley at 2,140 meters above sea level, which is very prone to earthquakes. The next day, we had one of the most terrible floodings of the season. This is the neighborhood of Ecatepec, which is a kind of community of 3.1 million inhabitants in the northern part of the Mexico City metropolitan area, and in which the flooding put this reminder, as Sara was saying, that we live in a lake. We may colonize, urbanize, infrastructuralize the lake, but the lake is there to remind us that we are the foreign entities and not the water that floods us. And just this past Friday, in the hills of Chiquihuite, also to the north of the city, and probably related to the fact of so much precipitation, we had the slave, kind of rocks falling down and putting under mud and debris 10. there was a collapse and falling down of a structure of an elevated subway in Tláhuac, which resulted in over 30 people, close to 30 people dying. This talks about a kind of a more relevant matrix in my mind, which is what's the role of architecture, planning, landscape design in addressing these deeper challenges, these deeper failings, and how are we either just spectators or active participants in imagining a new, a different and improved kind of city. And I'm going to talk about housing and mobility, not because they are the only challenges, but because they're the ones in which we feel we have been engaged more recently. And this is a city which simultaneously is producing elevated highways all over, assuming, as Sara was saying earlier, that even though 7 out of 10 trips in the city are being made in public transportation, we are producing an infrastructure for the private car. And this has been kind of the modus operandi for the last 2 decades. And the irony is that it is progressive, left-leaning governments, the ones that have been building these elevated highways. Simultaneously and paradoxically, it is the governments, and this is more recent, the ones that are producing alternative modes of transportation. This is the cablebus or the cable cars, similar to Medellin and many other cities nowadays, implementing models of innovative public transportation models. I like to always show this image of Hector Garcia, a famous photographer of the 50s and 60s, because it shows kind of a Mexico in a nutshell. This is an indigenous man in the historic center of Mexico City, the neighborhood that Gabi was talking and explaining, as well as Sara earlier on. And it is a city after a flooding in front of a small mom and pop shop called La Mexicana with the Pepsi signs outside. It is a city about historical heritage. It is about the notions of the historical urban landscape that Gabi was talking, not only about the built environment, but about ways of living. And this also talks about the fragility of a city we live and have to work in. We move to the peripheries, the ones that Sara showed, and this is the area called Ciudad Nesa. Back in the 1990s, at the time I coincided with Benjamin and with Paco at the GSD, I decided to do my doctorate on the question of Ciudad Nesa, an informal neighborhood and an informal urbanization in the peripheries. And what used to be the problem of how do we urbanize, and how do we address the question of urbanizing a lake, and where half the city has been produced outside traditional planning and regulatory frameworks, and when our notions of housing have been built outside what we would traditionally imagine regulated form of housing. What does that say about our forms and procedures? And this is the same neighborhood that has been represented fantastically by Alfonso Cuarón in his film Roma. It is the peripheries where the maids are living, where he is looking for the boyfriend. It is an area where the marginal in all its extents, social and urban, is happening. And we have been, I always say that when you talk and do enough research about a topic, at some point someone's gonna look and ask for not only your opinion, but to actually work in this issue. And this has been the case for questions of mobility. In 2014, our office was fortunate enough to win the Audi Urban Future Award. And it had to do with understanding what is the role of the possibilities of architecture and urban planning to question and to improve on the issues of mobility. And we, similar to Sara's diagrams, we developed this series of cartographies that try to imagine not only the infrastructural and physical aspects of mobility, but actually what they meant at the social level. Which inequities are being produced in these infrastructures of mobility, who's winning and who's losing, who's having to make the sacrifices, both either in terms of location, in terms of comfort, in terms of safety, and in terms of time spent on public transportation. And this is the neighborhood of Nesa nowadays. This photograph, which was used in the book The Endless City by Ricky Burdett, and a photograph by Armin Linke, and which represents this materialization of the growth that Sara explained earlier. And it was one of the neighborhoods I researched during my doctoral dissertation. But fast forward 10 years, and we were asked to work, since had been talking and giving lectures about Nesa, we were asked, okay, so you think you know something about Nesa, how about designing a new public transportation system for Nesa, which was based on the BRTs, the bus rapid transit system corridors, beginning to be implemented in the Mexico City proper. And now this was the second line to be implemented in the state of Mexico. And our office was in charge of developing this bus rapid transit system. The whole master plan for an 18-kilometer long corridor, which would move hundreds of thousands of people every day, changing the dynamic of access to work, access to opportunities, access to public space. So the question is, how not only do you plan for the infrastructures that will benefit the poorest of the poor, but actually how do you begin to address questions of design in which not only the corridor moves the buses, but actually it has a cycleway. Not only is about producing, let's say, infrastructures with a lowercase I, but actually understanding how people approach a station, how do you address questions of safety in walking and in cycling. And this approach that combines mobility, architecture, and urbanism is something that has guided our practice. We have been fortunate enough, as Benji was saying earlier, in an introduction, to work in 2 more additional transportation hubs. One for Tacubaya, which is the equivalent of a business improvement zone, where a partnership between 16 developers and the city have begun to transform an old area of the city, an area that has cultural heritage, into a hub of investment, because it is very well located, very well connected through a multiplicity of subway lines, the BRT lines, as well as close to a lot of jobs. So we have been fortunate to be working with 3 clients here. One of them is a corporation called Tavistock. The other one is the Mobility AVO, which is one of the leading mobility companies in Mexico, which operate buses, and a third small developer. And now we're building over 1,500 units of affordable housing here, as well as a transportation hub. But this is a place where an understanding of a problem, an understanding that it is this crisis of mobility and this crisis of accessibility that becomes the obstacle for further development. But to actually intervene and begin acting in some of these places, whether it is these massive multimodal hubs with over 100, the equivalent of 1 million square feet of development, including the bus station, including a shopping arcade, and including housing and a rooftop, requires to recognize that architecture and the design professions are full of contradictions. This act will probably entail forms of gentrification, and the awareness of those contradictions require the tools to deploy methods of control. We need to understand that every single act of architecture and design is already problematic in itself about the way we relate to nature and the city. And in this recognition, there comes a possibility of finding epiphanies, of convincing some of the clients. For example, this is for the private client, in which we managed to say that to be part of this program that guarantees affordable housing, by producing 30% of every unit here in affordable housing, you would have a streamlining of the processes. So to convince the clients to engage in this type of policies goes beyond the traditional goodwill of addressing the big problems and challenges of our time. And this is these are some of the projects we're doing in Tacubaya. The second intermodal hub is one in the eastern part of the city called San Lázaro or Tapo, which are these, again, no man's land territories of huge infrastructures. We have a regional bus station, 3 subway lines, as well as bus companies. So sometimes the act of architecture is only facilitating the minimum infrastructure for people to move from one system to the other without getting rain falling on you. In which you sometimes it's almost like working in the interstices of these huge infrastructures that came before us, and in which the 5,000 square meters of retail that happen next to the station are almost like minimum interventions that facilitate huge flows of people. So this is to address the question of mobility is maybe to take a step back from the hyper powerful, alpha macho attitudes of architecture, and to understand that sometimes universal access and a good roof do the job. The other big aspect I wanted to show, and which is already touched upon in the projects of Tacubaya, is the question of housing. This image, which is not Photoshop, it's one of the peripheries, not very far away from the ones that Sara shows the kind of housing that up until 2006 was produced in most Mexican cities, which is half the production was formal developer-driven affordable housing, which is on the right, single family in most cases, very limited services and infrastructure, and the other half still remained informal urbanization, basically house which was self-built, unregulated and unplanned. To think, and Sara, while her work at the SEDATU, the Territorial Ministry of Urban Development, understood and approached that to actually cater the negative externalities that we had in informal housing, we needed to develop different policies to also change the developer-driven model. And it's always a hassle. It's always about carrots and sticks. And it has to do with disciplinary questions of typology and morphology, questions of how do we produce density and how we shape buildings, how do we maximize the use of urban space, but also how do we resolve typologies that address new demographics, such as the smaller families, such as unwed couples, such as lesbian, gay, queer housing, which has not been addressed traditionally in the policies put forward by government. And we have been fortunate enough to work in affordable housing in a number of projects, having finished over 2,000 units of affordable housing in the city, all of them located within a quarter of a mile of public transportation, all of them in which there's at least 8 different variations, typological variations and diversity in housing. And all of them understanding that to produce housing is not only about the unit itself, but actually how do you facilitate urban life and jobs. The first one was a project in the Colonia Doctores, and this second one is in Iztapalapa. And it's, in a way, it's kind of a simple approach to going back to the questions of courtyard housing. It's about understanding the fixed and the flexible. It's about guaranteeing that you can still look at your children play in a courtyard from the window. It's about understanding that some of these people who used to be the ones doing the self-built home need to understand that architecture, if it's going to make a difference, has to provide an extra that informal housing does not create. And more recently, we have been working and collaborating with our good friends from Productora, one of the most innovative practices in Mexico City, in developing multifamily housing, which is a kind of a different animal. It's about rental housing. It's understanding that house and housing should not necessarily be about ownership, that we need to develop alternative models of guaranteed dwelling, but some of them which will come through rental housing. And these 2 projects are in Guadalajara, but this last one is in Mexico City, actually in the limits of the historic center, in the street of Bucareli. So what does it mean to produce 80% of the units as studios? It means that a whole new demographic is willing to give up on the distances, on the idea of having a small house with a tiny garden on the peripheries, and is looking forward to having and prefers not to put yourself on a 20-year mortgage, but to actually rent and have the diversity to move around as you move around in different cycles of life. 80% of the units in these buildings are studios, and the other 10% are 1 and 2 bedrooms, which just talks about the shift. And it talks about also kind of a different amenities and communal life. These 3 buildings are already under construction. This one is in Bucareli, just 1 block from Reforma Avenue. And finally, when we talk about mobility and housing, we don't talk only about the questions of housing alone or transportation infrastructure. We talk about the whole spectrum of providing the infrastructure for social living. One of the probably most interesting policies of the recently New Mexico City government is the initiative called Pilares, which are hubs of innovation, liberty, knowledge, and recreation, which are small infrastructures, 500 and 600 meters, placed all over the city, but especially in very poor neighborhoods, which will be the equivalent of what the CESCs are in Sao Paulo. Remember the one by Lina Bobardi, but other small, somewhere in between the public library, the cyber school, the childcare facility, and the small arts and crafts facilities. And we have been invited to develop 2 of them, one in Benito Juarez in Mixcoac, which is right in the middle of a park, an old area that was used by drug dealers as a kind of the hub of this particular park, is being transformed into one of these small facilities, which again have classrooms, have meeting facilities, have open spaces. And actually this is under construction, and we should be finishing this in 2 to 3 months. All cast poured in place concrete with this big skylights. And for us, this idea had to do with, even in the context of very tight public work projects, how do we produce a sense of civicness? Even if this is a very flat single-story building, these skylights, not that different from the ambitions that both in the Moneo work in Murcia, is how do you achieve through small moves a sense of civic pride, which is fundamental in works such as this one. So this is these pictures are from last week. So it is this kind of new pavilion in the park, which had to do with this other idea of the least possible, least intrusive work in this area that had already been impacted. And the second one is in Iztapalapa, the one of the most poorest and the largest borough in Mexico City proper. This used to be a former safe house used by drug dealers and by kidnappers to keep. It was a property where they kept people they had kidnapped. So the act of actually reclaiming the site and actually doing a lot of head work with the community, which goes back to Gabi's comment that to transform the landscape requires social participation at multiple needs. Is something which in this particular shape building we kind of produce what we call this almost IMP National Gallery scheme of triangles, a street that goes in through the center in a kind of a courtyard, and this steel structure, which is again appealing to the sense of civic pride, creating a reference. These pictures are from a month ago, but as you understand, how do you create a small hubs of transformation where architecture can begin to reclaim back the possibility of symbolic and significant change? And this is again, in 2-3 months, we should be opening up this. I'd like to end with 3 images, which in my mind, put forward what I feel are the contradictions of our practice. and the challenges here. I think that there's three aspects that are beyond the realm of design, and they're beyond the realm of architecture. One, and by the way, they're the same challenges that as Benji was reading the first statement about the original populations of these lands. This is one of the big tasks we have, not only as Mexico as a country, but I think the world in general, to recognize who's been left out of these conversations. How do we put forward policies which make sense of these conversations? Just less than a month ago, the new progressive government is trying to make an attempt to reclaim a voice for indigenous communities. And in this process of telling the history, they built a fake pyramid right in the smack of the center of the Zócalo. And they put forward a thematic sound and light show. This goes hand in hand with just a couple of weeks ago, the statue of Christopher Columbus was taken down by authorities, and in place they're gonna do a very problematic statue of an indigenous woman, by the way, designed and sculptured by a white male heterosexual, recognized, globally recognized artist. And the question for me is not only how do we put forward these ideas of recognition and these ideas of writing and rewriting our histories, and to give value, as Gabi was insisting, how do we produce the processes which are neither only the tokenism of changing one statue of one official history by another statue of another official history, but to actually bring forward the voices that are left out. And some of the critique from the left to these kind of moves has nothing to do with the similar discussions you are doing regarding Confederate statues, but has to do is how do those communities which were left out, which were aggravated by these acts, are given a voice in imagining their landscape and their cities and their architectures. And finally, in a country where every single day 9 women are killed in violence, to ignore as a profession, both in forms and in procedures, what do we do in a country where violence is still very much at the root of our quotidian news and quotidian practices? And what do we do as a profession to raise a voice, to raise a hand and say, there's ways to imagine the cultural landscape that produces safer communities. There's way to imagine mobility that produces safety for that 51% of the population. There's ways to imagine production of housing that becomes a safe and a safer environment for this, for women at large and for women in the city. Thank you very much.